Thank you, Marie Christine. And it's a pleasure to be with you all. I have been looking forward to the talk for a while, and it's great to be here, especially among some old friends. And it's my hope that we can engage this theme today of what it takes to create healthy communities. So as you may have imagined, I prepared some slides for today. I'll go ahead and share my screen now. All right. So the title of my talk is The Role of Psychological Science in Creating Healthy Communities. When I looked at the theme for your conference for this year, I was inspired by the idea of having a conversation this morning of what it looks like to actually engage our discipline and even more specifically, the science of our discipline to engage these questions of healthy communities and promoting healthy communities. So my hope is in both narrative form and some engagement with one another and engagement in this community that we've created this morning, that we can have a dialogue and hopefully a meaningful inquiry in this very question.
And Dan, I'm wondering, I just realized if we're starting a little bit early, we may have some people who are just going to come on at 9. So maybe with that introduction, we can ponder that question or use the next 5 minutes, however you would like, but before starting the main part. Is that okay with you?
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah,
that's fine. So yeah, maybe we can just do some basic community building using the chat for these next few minutes. If we could start, you may have already done this yesterday. Just I'm gonna hopefully keep a relatively active chat going so people can feel engaged and participating throughout. So maybe if we can just check in with where people are joining from today, just to get some geographic representation into the room. Would that be okay if people just sort of drop into the chat where they're joining from?
I think that's a great idea. Where's your community? Yeah.
This is Steve. I'm in Southern Oregon in the town of Medford. It's really just 30 miles from the California border.
Awesome.
I am Bill McConaughey, and I'm in private practice in Eugene.
Wonderful. Welcome. Lots of people joining in on the chat too. Corvallis, Oregon City, Hillsboro, Sherwood. Wonderful. All over the state.
Harry Stymack. I'm also joining in from Cresswell, but practicing in Eugene.
All right. All right. Susan joining in from Italy. Welcome. Wonderful. And ordinarily I would be joining in from Seattle, but we've been making our way, first trip in a long, long time, by car to visit my in-laws in Chicago. So we're a day away, presently in Omaha, Nebraska. And so I am a Pacific Northwesterner now for quite a stretch, but currently here in the Midwest. All right. Well, what do you think, Marie Christine?
Is there another question that you have perhaps before we start about the topic? What does a healthy community look like? Maybe that's too broad. Maybe you're going to go into that for a breakout room, but yeah, I'm sorry, the announcements went way faster than I thought. So
that's all right. I do have some questions more topically built into the presentation, so I'm not sure I have have one right front of mind, but I guess it would be helpful to know, I imagine many of you are in private practice. Maybe if we just check in with some of the roles that we have within this community of psychologists and psychology. So if you'd be willing, on chat or unmuting, just to share some of the roles that you play in the community related to your membership in OPA.
It's a great idea.
I'm Lucia Marks, and I work at Quest Center for Integrative Health in Portland, and it's a program that serves many people, but marginalized people, and believes that you have to have community in healthcare and help people really meet together and talk together, and the community is the foundation and needs to be of healthcare.
Wonderful. See, neuropsychology, academic psychology, private practice, the VA, clinical health psychology.
Harry Steinbeck, working in integrated behavioral health with Oregon Medical Group in Eugene.
Wonderful. Welcome.
I work in private practice and also teach. Main focus and practices with gender and sexual minority groups and a lot of cultural diversity. And then I teach LGBTQ psychology class I created, and also social psych at the undergrad level.
Wonderful. Welcome.
One of the aspects of my practice over the years has been doing research in political psychology. So I'm curious about how a politically ideal community, or one striving for that label, would differ from a healthy community. It sounds like we have two different frames of reference we could be thinking about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
Wonderful. Thank you all for adjusting to the time frame, and thank you, Dan. So it's 9:01, so we can start with the main keynote.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Marie Christine, again for this invitation, and it's a pleasure to be with you all. I actually love that we had a chance to more spontaneously figure out how we wanted to engage community and to be with one another and to introduce ourselves. I think that, I think as an academic psychologist, a clinical scientist, too often we get lost in the theory and the vagueness of some of these questions without realizing that the answers are often right in front of us, like in real time. So I appreciate that we've begun to create community this morning together. So the title of my talk is The Role of Psychological Science in Creating Healthy Communities. And I'll say a little bit more about how I hope we can do that in just a moment. As has become customary, I wanted to make a land acknowledgement, both the lands that I reside in within the Seattle area, as well as some of the indigenous peoples of Oregon, not exclusively, but at least to bring some of these names into the room as we honor some of what it means geographically to be in community with one another. And so in that spirit, we pay respect to the Duwamish and the Salish peoples, the Multnomah, the Katlamet, the Clackamas, Tumwater, Watala bands of the Chinook, and all indigenous nations of the Columbia River, past, present, and future, and their continuing presence in the homeland and throughout their historical diaspora. And it does feel important as we think about community to include what relevance geography has in that place. So that is, I guess, a living question for all of us to consider the history of our lands. So the hope I have this morning for our agenda is to spend just a minute or two introducing myself, so you know who I am and how I come to some of these ideas. to name our present context, especially within the last 13 months of multiple, epidemics and pandemics that we've been surviving. Then spend a few minutes talking about what I think the unique role of psychological science is in engaging questions of healthy communities. Spending the next few minutes then in defining, as Bill had asked, what it means to be in healthy community and different frames we can use for that question. And then my real way of moving into this topic in greater depth is to share with you a couple of my research areas, which are looking at oppression and inequities in communities and looking at loneliness and social division within communities as two case examples. And my hope is that in presenting these case examples, they'll illustrate, not perfectly, but attempts at how psychology and psychological science can be utilized to support the health of communities. So, before I get too abstract, I'll just say that I don't know that there's a topic that's more important to me than what it takes to create a healthy community, right? When I think about my own health and my own vitality and my own well-being, I think it's often significantly correlated with how I'm doing in relation to community or communities. And I'm guessing that's the same for all of us. But I'll try to keep things specific and real as we're going through these slides so that we, again, don't get too theoretical or too far afield. But I guess I'll say first and foremost that this topic really matters to me. And I'm guessing it really matters to you also, and that's why you're here. As we go through the talk today, I'm gonna make an attempt to distinguish between three levels of analysis: the intrapersonal, meaning how we experience or don't experience community inside our skin at an intrapersonal level; how we experience community between us, which is often most how we think of community at that relational level. And then I want us to also think about the structural level, systems, policies that create healthy communities or serve as obstacles to healthy communities. So I'd like to share a little bit about my own context and how I come into understanding community, with recognition that each of us has a particular context. So in the center there is my grandfather, who I called Zaidi, which is Yiddish for grandfather. And he was an immigrant to the United States. That was him as a 9-year-old on the left-hand side of the screen. And I think I was about 9-year-old. That's me in the red coat there. And, and then up to the right of the screen, that's him, Ben Rosen, as an 18-year-old. And so that 9-year-old boy on the left was getting ready to immigrate. You could say it was something of a forced migration. This was the early 20th century, and as a Jewish person living in Eastern Europe, he was attempting to flee persecution, oppression, eventually what became an attempted genocide. And as we consider the role of geography and community, it's I think one important factor that for many of us, we're not living where we were born or where we grew up, or perhaps we're not living where our parents were born or grew up, or for some of us, perhaps grandparents or great-grandparents. I do understand that not everyone in this land is an immigrant, right? We have a huge percentage of our population that did not come here by choice from enslavement. We have indigenous community that is, part of our community, part here with us today. We have people who came and I arrived at this particular place in the Northwest for many different reasons. And I think that that too plays a part in who our community is and how we define community and what it means to be in community. You know, for me, one of the really interesting parts about being Jewish is that, you know, in many ways, Jews as an ethnic group, as a cultural group, are not tied to geography. You know, we've been, in many respects, a nomadic people with a nomadic sense of self. But, you know, I think here in this room, I'm guessing that many of us take pride at living in the Pacific Northwest. It's beautiful, right? I mean, the land is tremendous. And there are ways that geography, I think, plays a part in that. And I think immigration history, or just history of movement, right? Or colonization can play a role in all of that. So I wanted just to acknowledge, in part, because I like looking at pictures of my grandfather, but you know, just to acknowledge that we're all bringing histories with us into this conversation. In terms of my own professional history, as Marie-Christine mentioned, I'm currently at Bastyr University, where I've been for the last 14 years. Bastyr is a university focused in health sciences, originally founded as John Bastyr Naturopathic Medical College, and it has a really impressive vision statement. The vision of Bastyr University ends with this idea that what we are about is the transformation of the health and well-being of the human community. And to be honest with you, that's why I took a job at a place I had never heard of before, because I was so impressed with this vision statement, right? I had planned to teach at in a PhD program at in a department of psychology, you know, like I had gone through myself a few times over. But the idea that there is a vision of health, a view of transformation that really can engage what the health of our communities looks like is why I joined faculty there and why I've stayed, right? And so I wanted to share that because it's really central to the topic today. I wanted to also acknowledge the community of APA. I've been a member since 1998 and proud division member of 17 and 45. And I also wanted to acknowledge my other professional home, which is ACBS, the Association of Contextual Behavioral Psychology, Science rather, ACBS. I'm a psychologist within that organization. I think we have at least one other ACBS member with us today. I think I saw Hank Robb here, which is wonderful. I wanted to share my main line of research, which is focused on the elimination of race-based mental health disparities, which Marie-Christine mentioned earlier. And then another study that I'm going to be talking briefly about, which is a study I collaborated on with my friend and colleague, Jonathan Cantor, over at the University of Washington, which was a COVID-19 coping study. I'm also in private practice, just a day a week in Seattle, and so can resonate and engage these questions with many of you who are clinicians as well. So I'll hope to occupy that frame as we go through these questions as well. Because I do all of my work in relationship and in community, I wanted to also acknowledge my primary research collaborators, Dr. Jonathan Cantor at the University of Washington and Dr. Robin Gobin at the University of Illinois. And a lot of what I'm going to be sharing with you today was developed in direct collaboration with the two of them. And I wouldn't be able to do the work I do without the two of them and many other people. I feel like it's a privilege being primarily at a teaching university to be able to employ psychological science and engage my clinical scientist mind. And it's largely thanks to the relationships I've been able to develop with others and to do this work in community. So I'm sharing that both to acknowledge them in particular and to acknowledge the fact that, I don't know that any of us do any good work alone. We're constantly doing our best work, I believe, in community. And if I'm being honest, when I think about taking on any new project, the first question I ask is, who do I want to spend more time with, right? Because if I don't enjoy spending time with someone, it takes all the fun away from it, right? And I imagine many of you can resonate with that. It would be somehow missing a big part of the picture if we didn't acknowledge the current context for our conversation today, May 1st, 2021, of what it means to be in a healthy community. And I wanted to read this quote. Some of you may have seen Mia Birdsong's new book, How We Show Up. This is a quote that really moved me that I thought I would share just to contextualize some of what I hope will be engaging today. She wrote, "We're living in a contradiction. We're made for interdependence, connection, and love, but part of a culture that espouses the opposite. Creating and keeping what is counterculture requires vigilance. We stumble, backslide, and forget. There is a tension between existing in one world while trying to live into another one. That place in between them is full of friction, but like so many change processes, the thing we are trying to get to holds the key to getting there. Reclaiming and reinventing family, friendship, and community is a process we do with our family, friends, and community." Isn't that beautiful? My thought here in sharing this with you is that as we're talking about what it means to be a healthy community, the only way we would know how to do that is to attempt to be a healthy community together, like right here and right now. And so if we're thinking about what a healthy community and generating a healthy community looks like in the VA or in another medical center or a health delivery system or a private practice or a classroom, that's a question we can ask in the here and now, in the present moment. Our present moment, as I am sure you are well aware, has included 13 months of living within an historical global pandemic, within the constraints and confines of COVID-19. And I think as we consider together as psychologists what our unique role is in sustaining our community through this pandemic, and also the residual impact that is projected to be for years, once we finally come out of this, I don't need to tell you, I know you already are well aware that it's going to redefine in many ways what it means to serve our community. We've seen this already with telehealth and telemedicine. And we know that for many people, the real impact of surviving a disaster is not felt until SAMHSA says actually 6 months after the pandemic concludes, whenever that might be, right? We also know, this is a photo from Oregon Health Sciences vaccination distribution. We're in a new phase right now, which means that many of us have been vaccinated in our communities, which means we know we have a lot of people who aren't interested in being vaccinated. What is the role of behavior change, for psychologists in that, at least for those of us that believe that we need to make sure our community gets vaccinated and healthy? What's the role of behavior change? And what role can we play in public health policy in the here and now? Alongside this pandemic of COVID, here's a shot from Portland several months back. We know we're in a period of ongoing racial unrest and reckoning, needed, right? And so what does it look like when we're talking about the calls being made for racial equity? And what does that mean specifically for health providers? Another shot from a march in Seattle several months back. And of course, beyond the Pacific Northwest, you know, there's a movement calling for racial justice and equity, is alongside movements for years now, calling for equity from a gender standpoint, gender identity, right? And I know a lot of the work you did yesterday was figuring out how we can support racial trauma that's been inflicted in community, and asking questions as well of prevention. So that's our context. So what then is the role of psychological science in all of this? And as Marie-Christine mentioned a few moments ago, if folks have questions that you want to drop into the chat, I don't have my chat visible because I found it too distracting. I'm on a smaller screen today as well. But if we can register those, hopefully we can come back to them. So I don't mean to be ignoring anything if it is in there. So many years ago, in my introduction to experimental psychology class at the University of Pennsylvania, I was in a room with Henry Gleitman, a wonderful psychologist, a Renaissance person. And he told me that psychology is the study of human behavior, and psychology is concerned with describing behavior, explaining behavior, predicting behavior, and ultimately changing or influencing behavior. And, you know, I know that's taking us back way far for me, and I'm sure for most of us, to our very first class, you know, in psychology. But it seems an important starting place, because I think that, especially as clinicians, we're very accustomed to the idea of changing or influencing behavior. But when we have questions as big and as complex and nuanced as what it takes to support healthy communities, it occurred to me that we better go back to the starting point. Like, what is this discipline? What is this field all about? And when we talk about engaging psychological science, we have to do these sequentially, right? We have to be able to describe what is it, you know, that health and a healthy community and the behavior we're looking to promote or perhaps to extinguish looks like. How do we explain that behavior in descriptive, operational language? How do we predict when it happens and when it doesn't? And that's hard enough, let alone this last phase at a community intervention level, which is what I'm most interested and passionate about, which is how can we employ psychological science to change behaviors in service of healthy communities. I would argue that we have an ethical mandate, an obligation to do so. We can find that mandate looking at our ethical code, principles like Principle D of justice within the APA Code of Ethics, right? And as well as multiple guidelines for, these are just a recent set of guidelines for public initiatives within APA. The most recent or the ones that they are highlighting on their website right now is how do we serve clients who identify as bisexual, guidelines for assessment and interventions with persons with disabilities, the multicultural guidelines that were revised in 2017 after the initial document in 2001, 2002 that many of us at Arizona State got to be a part of alongside our mentor, Dr. Patricia Arredondo, guidelines for psychological practice with older adults, right? And I know that based on what folks dropped into the chat, these are areas that matter to people, right? So when we think about what is the role of a psychologist in supporting healthy communities, you know, some of that is told to us very directly through our professional ethics, right? We're not meant to be sitting passively waiting for our communities to be healthy. We instead have taken on a charge of supporting justice within our communities, supporting integrity within our communities, supporting human dignity within our communities. And I'm aware that how we define those specifically between us is going to differ, right? But what unites us, I think, as psychologists is that, you know, alongside these ideas that really matter of how do we do this one-on-one within an office space, let's say an individual psychotherapy, psychology is also involved in studying ideas that can be applied to a systems level, to apply to a community level. It's not only understanding individual behavior. And so I would contend that psychological science is a really important piece of the puzzle of what it's going to take to support healthy communities. And, you know, with some humility, only a piece of the puzzle, right? So we work alongside, you know, political philosophers, political scientists, public policymakers, folks in the field of education, the criminal justice system, right? And on, city planners, to figure out what it looks like to support healthy communities. And if we're going to do this work well, no doubt it's going to be interdisciplinary and interprofessional. But I'm not a member of any of those other professions. So, you know, I do think that we have some important things that we can say about psychological science, which will be my smaller piece of the puzzle, maybe our collective smaller piece of the puzzle this morning. So what does it look like to be in a healthy community? And we're going to do some experiential work here in just a moment and actually get in conversation with one another. So in a few minutes, I'm going to ask you a couple of questions in smaller groups, but I'm just going to make a few framing comments, something like underlying assumptions, at least you know, of mine for the purposes of this talk. You know, one of the things that I've come to accept from an evolutionary psychological standpoint and an attachment science standpoint is that human beings are social bonding mammals, right? We have descended from our ancestors far back in an evolutionary perspective, and that evolutionary inheritance includes a very specific need for human contact and social connection, right? So I think that I don't believe this is controversial in any respect at this point, right? That people desperately need to be in healthy relationship with others in order to be healthy. And, you know, the way Brene Brown summarizes this is that, you know, we are constantly asking ourselves, am I safe? Do I belong? Am I safe? Do I belong? This refrain, you know, nearly every 45 seconds, it's going through our mind, that we are social bonding mammals and that our health is really predicated on being in healthy relationship. So said differently, I don't actually think there's any such thing as individual health without community health, right? I don't believe that someone can be living in a toxic community, but exist as a healthy individual, right? And there are all sorts of sayings that capture this, you know, that there's, you know, I am because we are, or, you know, the real recognition that we are interdependent. I think this has been there's been some really interesting work more recently trying to understand questions of, if we look at the very healthiest communities, some of you may be familiar with the blue zones, where there are a disproportionate number of octogenarians, you know, people that live really, really long lives, over 100 years old. And one of the most famous, the first of these in Sardinia, you know, in Italy. And what Susan Pinker, a Canadian psychologist, has written about in her book, The Village Effect, and she has a TED Talk as well on the village effect, says that the people who live the longest, you know, these like 12-year-old people wandering about this Italian island, seem to be surrounded in interlocking, interdependent communities where people know each other, where people know their neighbors, where people check in on each other, where people are seen by one another and see each other. It's also extraordinarily one of the very few places where men live nearly as long as women, right? Because these community attributes and these relationships exist for everybody. Almost every other place in the world, women outlive men, and I understand that's a binary way of talking about gender, but forgive me. That women tend to live significantly longer, and that is, for many accounts, attributed to being in good relationship, whereas men tend to be just lousy at that, especially as men get older. And so we know that, and we'll talk a little bit more about this when I give that case example of loneliness and division and opportunities therein. We know that it is healthy for human beings to be surrounded by community, to be in touch with one another. And yet, how many of you have ever tried to be in a relationship with another human being? It's pretty hard, right? It's like trying to be like in an intimate relationship, trying to be in a friendship with somebody, trying to be in a small working group with someone. Human beings don't do this so well, right? And what's the evidence of that? You could say rates of divorce, you could say rates of violence. There are all sorts of indicators. Just open up the front page of any newspaper on any day that human beings actually have a really hard time getting along. And so it's a paradox of sorts that we're wired for one another. We need one another. You know, we have mirror neurons that are literally, you know, wired for connection. And yet we have these challenges that we could say are also part of our evolutionary inheritance, which we'll talk about a little bit later in terms of in-group and out-group, that make it really hard, among other obstacles. So for the purposes of my talk this morning, I'm going to attempt a very basic definition of community, which posits that a community is any group of more than two people that declares themselves to be a community based on some shared interest or attribute. So, you know, I hereby declare us a community of people within OPA and a couple of guests like me that care about healthy communities and psychology, right? And that can be, we could probably come up with some fancier definition. It's not my particular area of research or scholarship, right, to provide such a definition. But I think for me, when I'm talking about community, I'm talking about any group of, you know, more than two people that care to be in community with one another and are declaring themselves so. So we're going to enter into a conversation with a small group, but before we do, I want to offer one piece of psychological science. After all, this talk is about applying psychological science to the creation of healthy communities. And so I'd like to present to you, or maybe refresh your memory if you've heard it before, the interpersonal process model. This was about 20 years ago, actually more, by Reese Collins and Ellen Burscheid. I got to take a class with Ellen Burscheid years ago in my master's program at the University of Minnesota. And they were trying to answer this question of how do we develop intimacy and trust and connection in relationships? And as many of you probably already know, social scientists like us are really good at taking incredibly intuitive, simple ideas and making models out of them and creating complex theory with names and acronyms. So for your viewing pleasure, the IPM, interpersonal process model, they explain that connection between two human beings, independent of context, whether this is you know, someone you're falling in love with, or a new friend, or someone in the workplace, that across context, intimacy and trust develops in a two-part process. The first part is one person is brave enough to share something that matters to them. In the model, it's called vulnerable self-disclosure. But it really just means that I'm being authentic, I'm being real, I'm telling you something that matters to me. And when a person is brave enough to do that, the one who receives it responds well, right? In the model, it's termed responsiveness. And responsiveness is defined as being kind, understanding, validating, caring, could even say loving. And really, that's it. It's a two-part process. One person takes a risk to share themselves, and when they do, the other person notices and responds well. And it's a reciprocal process. So both people are disclosing and both people are listening and responding. So we're about to move into a small group conversation, and I'm going to ask you to consider this model. To consider when it's your turn to share something that matters to you at your own comfort zone, right? Within your self-care zone. You don't need to, take too big of a risk, but see if you can share something that actually matters to you. And then when you're listening, see if you can respond well, whatever that looks like for you. It's typically responding well isn't judging, evaluating, critiquing, criticizing, but it's responding with curiosity, enthusiasm, excitement, something more about wondering. Does this make sense? All right. So I'd like to lead us in here. You've heard me talk long enough. Community isn't about one person taking up all the space. I understand it's a keynote, but that's not my intent. And so I'd like to ask each of you, what community or communities, if you need to choose a couple, are most important to you? Please share about a community that enhances your sense of psychological well-being and share what makes it important to you. So you'll have about 7 minutes, and in groups, we're going to be in groups of 4-ish, might be 5 for some of you. Take a minute and introduce yourselves to one another. You may already know some people in your group, but take a moment and just say hello. And then share for a minute or two about one community that's important to you, that enhances your sense of well-being, your sense of psychological health, and what makes it important to you. Does that make sense? So of course you have choice whether or not you want to participate. If you get a meeting invitation and you just need to take a break, or you're not up for your being in community today, in this sort of a way, of course you get to choose. If you want to send a private message to Britton, listed as our tech for the day, to say, please don't include me in a group, not up for it, that's totally fine. You can direct message Britton. But otherwise, in just a moment, you're gonna get an invitation to join a group, and you'll see a timer, if everything goes well, for 7 minutes. And we're gonna actually be in community, talking about the communities that you care about. All right? Okay. So Britton, whenever you are ready, I think we are good to go. So you'll just want to click the join button that popped up, that blue button in the middle of your screen or thereabout. All right, welcome back to those of you who are re-entering. I think we're still waiting for a few more folks.
All right, they're officially all closed.
All right, great. Oh, it's nice to see you all. Welcome back, everybody. So I'd like to invite people to just drop into the chat if you're willing, for those beyond your small group members, the name of a community you're a part of, or maybe just why the community matters to you, why it's important to you, with or without the name of the community, or both, just so we can present some of that, right? We are a community here this morning. You are a community of OPA, but you also are part of many communities that likely matter to you. And so, when we talk about community, of course, the personal is professional. We can't figure out what it means to be, in a healthy community without referencing our own experience in healthy communities, or at least communities that support our own health and well-being. So if we can continue dropping some of those into the chat, if people are willing, the invitation is just to present some of why communities that support your psychological health and well-being matter to you, why they're important to you. And as we do that, and you have a chance to hear from each other, I'm going to go ahead back to the slides here. Okay. So one of the areas that I think is most exciting right now in terms of work that's being done at the broader level within supporting healthy communities is work that's being done by David Sloan Wilson and Paul Atkins and Steve Hayes in the pro-social movement. And this is a book that the three authors wrote titled Pro-Social: Using Evolutionary Science to Build Productive, Equitable, and Collaborative Groups, that I would recommend if you haven't taken a look at it already. And what they've done is build on some of Elinor Ostrom's key design principles of what makes healthy relational communities. And so I don't know if this is true of the communities that you all have been talking about in terms of communities that you named that matter to you, but I would offer, you know, that these are some of the design principles that people who have been thinking about those broader questions for many years have come up with, and honestly are a lot smarter than I am, think are underlying or underpinning healthy communities. And they include that we have a clear group identity and a shared sense of purpose, a fair distribution of costs and benefits, that there's inclusive decision-making, that we're monitoring progress toward our community goals, that there are mechanisms for appropriate feedback to both helpful and unhelpful behavior, and that there is fair and fast conflict resolution, right? And I don't know about you, but I'm not part of a ton of communities that do all of these things exceedingly well, but I desire to be, right? And those are qualities that exist within any particular community or group. And then the qualities of how that group interacts with others includes recognition of group and member autonomy and appropriate relations with other groups. And of course, those things, those principles, those core design principles as they're named, are further defined. And there's a movement right now. If you Google pro-social, you'll see a website with all of that science and really great ideas at a larger scale level. And many psychologists are currently a part. And so I think this is one way, you know, that we can think about healthy communities, whether it's learning more about what ideas we might want within our own communities, or getting more involved and active in supporting the development of a collective understanding of how psychological science can be part of this conversation. I'd like to go back into groups now and ask one other question, which is, if you were attempting to select a couple of outcome measures that would, for you, define, you know, or serve as best proxies, you know, putting on your scientist, your clinical scientist hat for the moment, what two measures would you choose as most important? We're only gonna have 5 minutes this time. And most of you will be going back to the people that you were just engaging with a moment ago. But I want you to see, like, what would you be measuring? What would the indicator, the outcome measure, the dependent variable be that you would want to measure if you could only measure a couple of things that would serve as most representative of the health of a community? Fair enough? Okay, please go ahead. And when you get the invitation, please join the group if you're willing to engage in this conversation. So let's see if we can get some of these into the chat now too. So if you were to choose two dependent variables, two outcome measures that could capture the health of a community, what would you choose? And feel free to unmute. We can hear from, let's say, 3 people or so as well. Just briefly, the area that you would measure. Or if you prefer to drop it into the chat. So participation.
Can you
Thank
hear
you.
me?
Please go ahead.
I looked interconnectedness and collaboration.
Awesome.
Also willingness to be movable.
All right.
One that came up in our conversation was when people are talking or in a group, how many people actually get to talk and how long do they talk? Or are there some people who hog the podium and do all the talking and exclude others, don't let them talk?
Thank you. Yeah, so getting multiple voices in, and I feel like that shows up in the chat as well with ideas like participation, inclusion of all members, inclusivity. We have other people who have entered in freedom to have a voice, felt sense of connection, again, inclusivity, fun, that's a good one. Wonderful survival of conflict, healthy development of children. Wonderful, thank you. You know, and one thing I would just point out, maybe it's not needed amongst us, but you know, who else would you ask but a group of psychologists this question? Or at least I think that we probably need to take a seat at the table in order to figure out how we can support the health of communities, right? And for most of us, we were trained within a very individualistic frame where we were educated on how to support a single person, which granted is hard enough, right? Psychotherapy is incredibly challenging work. And right, if you're gonna ask, how do you support the health of a community? How do you support healthy human behavior? How do you support a community to navigate conflict, to navigate inclusion, to navigate fun? You know, I'm biased, I admit, but I would imagine it's important to have psychologists in part of that conversation. At a public health level, the CDC, as you may be familiar with, has declared social determinants of health. In many ways, these social determinants underlie a Masters of Public Health program. And I feel like a lot of what I feeling called for lately is to figure out how psychologists can be better partners to our public health colleagues. But many of the metrics that from a public health perspective are measured are in these 5 domains: education access and quality, healthcare and quality, and certainly that's where a lot of us currently practice. It extends, of course, to neighborhood and built community, like in city planning, to social and community context, which includes class and socioeconomic status and economic stability. And so as I was planning for today's talk, I did a number of Google searches, you know, as like in attempting to prepare, might there be another resource? And one day I typed in APA healthy communities. And guess what I found? A report from the APA on healthy communities, but not our APA, the American Planning Association. And there was a really nice infographic the planners used, the city planners, and they were making the call that we have a responsibility to support the health of our members. And they said, particularly in their report, you know, while it may be presupposed that it's all about genetics and healthcare, look at how much of a person's longevity, this is determinants of health and their contribution to premature death, lie in behavior and environment and social circumstances, right? And I would say for us too, you know, when we think about that purple, you know, piece of the pie, healthcare, and the light blue piece of the pie, behavior patterns, at least 50% is within our professional domain, right? So how do we want to engage these questions at a larger level here? So with the time we have remaining, I'd like to share very briefly 2 areas of my research where I have attempted to engage psychological science in service of healthy communities. This, to be clear, is not a research talk. I'm going to share some data, but I don't want to make it about the data. Instead, what I'm attempting to do is share, that there are a couple of things that I care about, deeply, and that's where my research is. And I want to just offer a couple of ways that I have imperfectly attempted to engage psychological science in service of healthy communities. So I'll say first, oppression and inequities. As I showed earlier, my family came to the United States largely fleeing persecution, oppression, genocide, right? And I know that's not a unique history in the world or in this country. And there are many histories, to be clear, but it's something that really matters to me, that people in community can be safe, that people in community don't have to worry about, basic needs. And so it's incredibly troubling to me when I see friends and neighbors and family who don't feel safe, who feel marginalized, who feel oppressed, who feel persecuted. And when I talked about the current context of racial unrest and reckoning, that's a lot of where my current work is trying to understand how we can apply psychological science to reduce racial bias and increase the health of connections of people across all cultural groups, and especially in an interracial context. So when we look at the state of healthcare delivery, we know that there are significant disparities in healthcare delivery in who gets access to services, who receives quality services, and once we receive those quality services, the differential outcomes that result. And people like one of my research mentors, Dr. Maggie Alegria at Mass General now, out in Cambridge, has developed the sociocultural framework for health service disparities. And as you can see, it's a pretty complicated model. And if you look down here at the lower left-hand quadrant, that's sort of where we come in as clinicians, provider and clinician factors, right? And ultimately, what we're trying to remedy is poor clinical encounters where there's a lack of community trust, where there's diminished alliance, where there's biased decision-making, right? And one way, and of course, we can address healthcare disparities in many, many ways, including at the policy level, including access to care, which I know is being done right now in Oregon, advocating for true equity from a mental health parity perspective, right? But we also can zoom into that level of what happens when a person actually gets in to see their mental health provider, their psychologist for the first time. And my attempt in this regard has been, how do we apply, for me, contextual behavioral science, because I am particularly passionate about the application of acceptance and commitment therapy and functional analytic psychotherapy, and more contextual behavioral science and change processes, which include connecting people to their values and what matters to them, trying to understand the internal obstacles of thoughts and feelings and sensations that derail us or get in our way from acting in accordance to our best selves. And, and really focusing on that operationalized behavioral level. How can we apply psychological science to many domains in healthcare, higher education, legal profession, community? But specifically, what I'll be talking about today is in the context of clinical services, to both decrease harmful behavior that's happening largely among white people engaging in racial microaggressions against Black people and other communities of color. And also, how can that science be applied to support the coping, healing of BIPOC communities, Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, right? And so that's a question that I've been asking, with my colleagues, of how can we apply psychological science and take what we know from decades of good clinical science and apply it to a social problem. And we know from several studies now, we've done studies within college student populations, within delivery of medical services. I'm glad, just email me and I can get you references. But I'm putting this up just so you know that I'm not completely making all of this up, that we have a number of studies in books and journals in a variety of disciplines. And we're trying to understand, based on the initial work of Chuck Pierce, how can we remedy, what is the antidote for preventing racial microaggressions, right? Which Pierce defined as everyday interpersonal slights or interactions, which can include, as were taxonomized by Gerald Wing Sue in 2007, many themes like forced racial categorization, for example, asking an Asian person, where are you from, right? Or color blindness, I don't see color. I imagine the idea of racial microaggressions are quite familiar to most people in the room. And so my sharing this with you is not to review the taxonomy of racial microaggressions, but to share with you what we've attempted to do in applying a scientifically minded approach to understanding microaggressions. What we've recognized is that, you know, in general, the interventions in the diversity, equity, and inclusion space are pretty much summarized as don't do that. You know, microaggressions, an NPR headline, be careful what you say. Or from the Business Insiders, think before you speak. That's the best way to avoid a microaggression. Some of you may remember the classic Bob Newhart comedy sketch where he plays the therapist just shouting at the client, you know, stop it, stop it. But what do we know about stopping it? You know, what we know is, in part, this is from Jack Davidio's lab a few years back at Yale with Perry, that the more we gain an awareness of our biases, the more what? The more anxious we are interacting across race or any difference. I would imagine this would hold true, right? So the idea of telling someone, get aware of your biases, right? Generate more understanding of all the ways that you, based on your history and your socialization, are biased, and then don't do that, well, good luck, right? Especially when in that moment we're in a heightened interracial state of anxiety, sometimes summarized as IGA, intergroup anxiety. We know that avoidance and suppression are not behavior change strategies, right? Think about your clinical practices. For those of you are clinician, we know that to be true from decades of research in anxiety. Telling someone stop it or don't do that, it just doesn't work. We can think about, you know, the inadequacy of diet culture, where we know that 95% of people who try to stop eating weigh more a year later, right? It just doesn't work. It's not bad or wrong, but it just doesn't work. Based on Daniel Wegner's research at Harvard on thought suppression, there was a really interesting study, a couple actually, in sports psychologists, where they found that if you asked hockey players to shoot a goal, you know, into the net, but whatever you do, don't miss the puck right. Well, what happens? They're more likely to miss right in that spot that you told them not to miss. Same thing is true. They replicated it on a dartboard, right? And same thing is true if you ask someone not to think about something. Telling someone not to mess up doesn't work. And of course, Wegner's first study, based on Dostoevsky's idea of like, try not to think of a white polar bear. You know, you can do that experientially right now. Try not to think of a white polar bear. And guess what you're thinking about? A white polar bear. So telling people don't mess up, don't be racist, don't be sexist, don't be transphobic. It's not that it's a bad idea. Like but you know, if a client came in and you told them, don't be anxious, don't be sad, don't be angry, it's just not good treatment. And we know that, right? And we have decades of science to tell us that. And so what we have done is try to understand what is the underlying function going on? What is the mechanism that gives rise to these microaggressions? This taxonomy of Sue's has been really, really useful, but it doesn't actually explain why people are doing what they're doing. So based on a measure we created, in a factor analysis of that measure, what we found is that there are 4 underlying psychological processes that we believe underlie racial microaggressions. And they are objectifying, in some ways dehumanizing a person and getting hooked by differences, right? Imagine coming into a room and all you notice is, the differences, like the racially distinct features of a person's face, or you see someone who's from a different group and all you can think about is the one other person from that ethnic or racial community, or so on. That would be objectifying. Stereotyping, right? Any range of stereotypes about that group. Anxiety and avoidance, behaviors that are motivated by anxiety and primarily getting rid of or moving away from that anxiety, or denying group identity is important. Race doesn't matter. Gender doesn't matter. I'm just going to see everybody as human. I'm going to just deny the relevance of any differences. And so the reason why it was important for us to actually arrive at underlying psychological mechanisms or processes is so we could intervene on them. So for each of the processes, we've then developed clinical interventions. That's what you saw captured in some of those research articles earlier, in testing these interventions. So for objectifying, we've developed a set of interventions, largely from acceptance and commitment therapy, called noticing, where we're actually, in a mindful way, aware of where our attention is going. For example, there's been really interesting studies using eye tracking software. When a person looks at someone who's racially different than they are, the person gets hooked by racially distinct features. Nose, lips, hair. And what aren't we looking at? We're typically not looking at the person's eyes. But we know that making facilitative, culturally appropriate, warm eye contact is how our nervous systems are soothed, right? But if you meet someone, imagine a new clinician in the waiting room, and they're attempting to welcome you to their practice, but they're not looking at you. And let's be honest, we all know when we're not being looked at, or we were looked at, not actually looked at, right? It can be extraordinarily disconnecting. So we've developed interventions to slow down and bring awareness, especially in these interracial moments, to where our attention, where our noticing is going. With the idea of stereotypes, we've taken ideas from the ACT tradition of cognitive diffusion and developed processes of how can you, once you notice that your mind is generating stereotypes, because we can't stop our mind from the thoughts that it generates, at least most of us can't. That's what 30, 40 years of thought suppression research has told us. How do we unhook, right? Don't believe everything you think. So how do you unhook from that? With anxiety and avoidance, we've developed specific experiential interventions focused on noticing feelings and thoughts with gentle acceptance. And with denial, being mindful of defensive reactions. So my point isn't to give you an exhaustive summary of this work. That's a different talk. But I'm instead trying to share how we have taken the benefit of our science and the scientific method and thought, okay, if we care about this, how do we identify and explain the behavior? And then ultimately, how do we create interventions to shift the behavior? And in doing so, have developed those intrapersonal, what we call mindfulness skills, just summarized in the last slide, and ultimately interpersonal skills, or skills of connection. So a person can actually show up and connect with their values. And when I teach this to my graduate students, I ask the question, what would it look like for you to show up as the clinician, as the doctor you want to be. We're not prescriptive about it. We don't tell you what you need to care about or what matters to you, but we know that behavior change most often results when a person is moving towards something, not away from something. So telling someone, when you're engaging with someone that you're anxious about or that you might have differences with, not to mess up, not to be offensive, not to say the wrong thing, we all know that's not it, right? It's not it for any other of our treatments. Why would it be it for this, right? So how do we actually show up consistent with our values? And an example of an exercise that we do that's a really simple one, we're not going to go full into it, but I'll just briefly explain it, is imagining that you're going to put your hand on the door and enter a dialogue or a conversation with someone that's culturally different from you. So you can imagine who that might be, maybe based on race or gender identity, class, and your hand is on the door, or maybe in the modern day, your index finger is on the clicker, getting ready to go into the Zoom meeting. And how can you connect to something that really matters to you? Is there a value that you have, right? Maybe it's justice, maybe it's health, maybe it's vitality, maybe it's peace, maybe it's kindness, maybe it's compassion, something that matters to you. And then through a more mindfulness-based visualization exercise, can you inhale, right, and bring in that value, and can you exhale and let go of whatever the anxiety and the charge is, not to make it go away, but just to make some room for it. And so we've developed, a workshop intervention that actually seems to make a difference. This is one small example of something experiential where we're identifying values in this case, noticing feelings, practicing acceptance, all intrapersonal strategies in service of ultimately interpersonal social connection. One other case example, and that is social disconnection. And here, let me sort of back up here. So I imagine there are questions and comments, and I would love to take them all. I invite you to drop anything into the chat, and I'm glad to follow up after today if you want me to respond to anything, or you want to hear more about something. I'm not going to have time to address things as fully as I'd like today, because I want to share one more example before we wrap up, but I'm absolutely glad to be in conversation with any of you if there's more you want to hear about or know about. So what I would say is, in summary, this is an example of a significant community health problem, right? Inequities, oppression, specifically as I named these microaggressions or disconnects that occur in the context of mental health delivery. And how do we actually engage psychological science to support clinicians and community members to show up more consistently with who they want to be in the world, with their values, with what matters to them? Okay. One more example, and that is looking at the social disconnect. And what I would offer is that there has been an epidemic of loneliness in the United States that preceded COVID and preceded social distancing, right? Loneliness as the felt sense of not having the amount of social contact that we need, of perceived isolation. And unfortunately, when we are more isolated and lonely, other people occur to us as more threatening. There's more social anxiety when we're lonely, which is unfortunate because it's the exact time we need to be bolstered to reach out, but social anxiety shows up, right? Loneliness is different than being marginalized, right? So when we're talking about feeling lonely, it's a different experience than being socially marginalized, right? But a lot of what we're talking about is not having the connection that we seek or that we need. And I certainly have had periods of life where I have felt lonely. I can think about middle school or early in my college experience. And I think most of us can touch into at least momentary periods of our life and how hard that is to feel like we don't have the social contact we need. And then you overlay COVID onto that for many people who were social distancing, and it's been a really, really rough go. But to be clear, this was a challenge that preceded the pandemic. And to make the point, both England and Japan have appointed formal ministers of loneliness. If this was a few years ago in England, after they did a survey in England that found that 9 million English, 14% of the population, felt lonely most of the time, some significant amount of time or most of the time, largely their elders. And in Japan, this was just a couple of months ago, they appointed a minister of loneliness to counter increased suicide rates. In the United States, we know from a large-scale Cigna study done a few years back of 20,000 people that 1 in 4 Americans rarely or never feel as though there are people that understand them. That only 53% of Americans have meaningful in-person interactions on a daily basis. And this is a probably too small of a slide, but if you look at the left-hand side of the slide, this is the percentage of people that always feel that way. So you look at 13% of people in the US feel that no one really knows them. 10% feel alone, 8% feel left out always. And then sometimes you have over half of the community, right? And this is 2018, this is before COVID. So we know that from decades of research that social integration, perceptions of our social network, intimacy, relationship quality actually really matter. They matter for how long we live. They matter for whether or not we are healthy or if we get sick, our cognitive functioning, social networks. The existence of social networks actually decreases the odds of dementia onset, not to mention happiness, meaningness, and loneliness is a significant risk factor. If you look at public health risk factors, being lonely or having an absence of social connection makes it 50% more likely that we will die early. So to be clear, loneliness and social connection has been a significant problem in our communities for quite some time. And then, of course, we had COVID in King County, where I live. If you remember back to February last year, there was a significant role, the unfortunate role that the Pacific Northwest played as the initial epicenter of the COVID outbreak. And you had people beginning February last year socially distancing. And yet we have photos like this one from Italy, where we know people have this deep desire to connect. So along with my primary research collaborator, Jonathan Cantor at the University of Washington, we were talking one day in early March, and we thought, what can we do? Is there a way that we can apply the science of social connection? Jonathan heads up the Center for the Science of Social Connection at the University of Washington. Is there a way that we can use the existing science on what connects people and supports the health of relationships and apply it in this moment where people are feeling isolated? And so we designed a brief text-based intervention with 1,600 adults nationwide, where people would get a different tip for 2 weeks. And we wanted to see, would it make a difference to get these scientifically informed tips? And so I want to give you a quick idea of some of these tips. So we had some tips that focused on awareness, the intrapersonal skills, things like a breathing meditation, a loving kindness meditation, disconnecting from the media, all with the pre-known efficacy, in the scientific literature. And we delivered these by way of text messages. There were audio files that accompanied them, different instructions, little 5-minute, 10-minute exercises that were all geared toward developing an awareness and then moving out toward social contact. There were other exercises, other days focused on vulnerable self-disclosure from the interpersonal process model of how can you actually share yourself in meaningful ways with people in your life. How can you reach out, and what might you talk about, and how might you engage them? And finally, there were exercise in responding well, again, based on the interpersonal process model. And what we found is during the 14 days of the intervention, people actually did better. They were less lonely, their relationships were of higher quality, and they felt less depressed. But it turned out that after they stopped doing the social connecting things, that the effect diminished significantly. And so our takeaway is that social connection is important. It works, that we certainly have ways that we can help people based on the scientific literature. We know what works, but it also needs to be sustained, just like eating, right? So there were a few examples, and like the last one, I would be more than willing to talk with any of you at length about the specifics of the different interventions and what we did. But more than anything else, what I was attempting to convey is another way that we can take the science and we can apply it in moments that matter. And that was a moment in early March where you can probably remember we were all at home and it was really unclear how long we were going to be in this for. At that time, I thought we were going to be doing this for a matter of weeks. But we were trying to think, how can we be of service? How can we use our expertise in service of community? And it wasn't done perfectly. The study certainly, had faults. We were trying to get it moving really, really quickly. But I'm not sharing it because I think it was a perfect study. I'm sharing it instead because for me, it was an attempt at how can I actually engage with our profession in a way that might matter. And so, my hope today is that I've given you a few things to think about in terms of what it might look like for you, based on what you care about and what matters to you. What might it look like to be active in your own communities in ways that matter to you based on the particular skills you have and the things you care about. And so one last slide I want to share with you is in getting to know your community a little bit. I learned that you have a really extraordinary legislative committee chaired by Ryan Dix, who I believe is here on the call. And I was told that if anybody wants to get involved at more of a policy level, just to reach out to OPA and they can put you in touch with Ryan. And that's whether it's policy level or connecting to local researchers, that's or just doing the work that you're doing as clinicians in community. My real hope is that there might have been something from today's talk that could be a seed and support you in some way in doing this work in your community. Now, being clear, I know that probably any of us could have given a talk like this today in terms of how we can engage psychology and psychological science in support of healthy communities. And I'm well aware that my voice isn't the only one that matters here in the room. And most of all, my hope would be that we can stay in conversation with one another and not lose sight when we go back to our separate Zoom rooms after this conference with our clients and colleagues of these larger questions of what an organization like OPA can do to engage community. So I want to thank you all very much. I want to apologize that there is not more time for meaningful conversation, though I hope you got to have some really nice conversations on the front end in your smaller groups. And again, if there are things that you want to be in touch with me about, I will drop my email into the chat here. Oops, let me do that one more time. And again, I am glad to be in conversation with you all. So it is 12:30. My last final invitation is when you have this opportunity to be with the actor and the monologue that Marie-Christine mentioned, if you can think about those sort of mindfulness skills and that I mentioned, and just see if you can make room for and notice what comes up, that would be a really meaningful way to engage experientially in some of what we've been talking about this afternoon. So thank you again. It's been a pleasure to be with you. I am secretly, and now not so secretly, wishing I had another 2 hours with you all. But I hope something that I shared was useful, and it's been a privilege and an honor to be with you today. And thank you again for the invitation, Marie-Christine.
Dr. Rosen, thank you so much. I'm looking at the chat and I agree with everything that's said. It was so helpful, informative, and centering.